Welcome back to Faith Infused Leadership. I'm your co-host, Meredith Bankett, and I'm here with your host and the founder of Faith Infused Leadership, Debbie Heiser. How are you today, Debbie?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thank you.
Awesome. So we were just having a great chat around the concept of words and why our word choice is so important in life, but in particular in leadership. So what did you want to share about that?
Yeah, so words are very important, and it's interesting because I'm even stepping back and slowing down as I think about the words I'm sharing right now. In respect to as we lead people, it's important to think about not only what they want to hear, but how it's skewing the message. And what I mean by that is I'm going to use an example, and I may have used it in an earlier video cast that we did around don't fake it till you make it, be it till you become it. It's the same basic message, but it's very different. And the second one is something that I can latch onto and say, absolutely, I can be it until I become it, versus saying fake it till you make it says I don't have that ability, and so I'm going to fake it. That doesn't feel incongruent for me because it feels inauthentic.
It doesn't feel good at all. I don't want to fake anything.
Exactly. And I have to be honest, I've used that saying numerous times when I was a sales trainer, all the time. And so when I heard that quote at the leadership symposium at Gonzaga, I thought, oh my gosh, this is life-changing. And that same thing holds true when I think about even when I do conferences. It's not about thank you for showing up today, or thank you for taking the time today, or even if I were to say thank you for taking the time to listen to this video cast, it's more of thank you for taking the time and investing in yourself and listening to what I have to share from my experiences. That's very different, and it puts the focus on, in this case, the listener. It puts the focus on whoever it is that I'm coaching for them to think about, versus it being focused more of a lens on myself, if that makes any sense.
Totally. So, in all your work with your clients, or just in your experience of engaging with so many businesses, where do you see managers just blowing it with their words? Where are we messing up the most? There's got to be a couple of areas that are just ripe for improvement.
Absolutely. And I would say the biggest one that I see is when they're frustrated with an employee or frustrated with a client. Because what happens is you can try to develop a client, you can try to develop an employee, but until they see the value for themselves, they're not going to make a behavior change. So what I see happen is managers then come into it with a negative reflection of here's what you didn't do, or here's what you didn't do right. Versus approaching it and saying, hey, here are the things that I observed that you did really well. Now let's take a look at some things that you might do differently because you might have more success with this later. Versus, Meredith, the way you approach this should have been done completely different.
Right.
And that's the number one thing I see. And it's a demotivator for anyone. That happens to me. If I have somebody say something to me in a way that says, ooh, that wasn't so great, versus, hey, have you thought about trying it this way? It might then attract this, or it might then be able to impact someone differently. That sounds very different. And it lowers people's defense mechanisms. And it goes back to a concept I talked about before with the waitress example or the waiter example, where if you know that my intention is to help you as an employee, because I know you want to come to work to do a good job. And as a leader, if that's my intention is to help you grow, then I need to step back. And frankly, I do a lot of praying when I come into these types of situations, to come into it not from an emotional standpoint, but what my true intention is.
Right. Well, and that also makes me think about using our word choice is also in relationship to, are we making a statement or are we asking a question? Because I feel like really great leaders have the ability to ask really phenomenal questions.
I would agree with that. And sometimes the questions may not be phenomenal, but they may ask a question that leads to what I call a generative dialogue, where it creates dialogue amongst a group of people or a couple of individuals that then allows for something beautiful to be created from that. So it's not coming in and posturing, it's not coming in and having your own agenda, it's being open to what might emerge from this entire conversation.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So clearly managers aren't getting it right when they are frustrated trying to move their teams in certain directions. But where else does this come up where word choice has an opportunity for improvement?
I hate to say everything, but Meredith, I think it's our internal voice. You know, I say we each have this voice that happens in our head, and you can equate it to coming from God or coming from the devil, you know, and not to get too crazy with that. But, you know, the thought being is that I call it K-Love radio. When you have those positive reinforcements going in your own internal dialogue, or what I call K-screw radio, and that's the doubt, the am I doing this right? I'm surely no one wants to hear from me. No one wants to see what I have to offer, or what do I have to offer. That to me comes from a place of fear versus a place of love. So anytime as a leader, I'm coming into something in a place of fear, it usually will come across that way. So if I have a vision or there's a goal and I'm communicating it from a place of fear, 9 times out of 10, people discern that and they don't buy into it.
Mm-hmm.
Or if I'm coming from a place of love, I typically will use words that come out in that intention of love. Does that make sense? And I know
Yeah, it
I'm
does.
realizing that it's everything, but it really is everything. Even the videos that we use, a conversation that I have with my child or my husband, anywhere. I remember, Meredith, honestly, when I worked for Citibank, spending a good part of an hour even working on how to communicate something as simple as the laws in Kansas City changed on where people could smoke. And so coming up with the right words to share that message so that people didn't feel like something was being taken away from them, but more so shifting it to a different place or it's a change. And I would say change management is also probably the secondary piece that I see leaders fail the most when it comes to communicating, because it's all about versus about the person.
Right, right. And also because change isn't easy for many people. And so that's something that really needs to be thought of. And what you're making me think of, I'm sure you know the four agreements.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's a it's called the four agreements. And you know the one agreement is to be impeccable with your word.
Yes.
And we can all go back and remember times where an employer said something to us, a boss said something to us, and those words just hurt and stung. And that doesn't move people forward. So I really understand what you're saying there. I think it's an incredible tip. So if I wanted to practice my word choice, if I wanted to have more intention and consciousness around that, what would you suggest someone do?
So I would suggest, actually, Meredith, and I'm coming with this off my hip, but I would suggest, first of all, that you slow down, that you take a pause, you take a moment to breathe. If you're in the situation or in the conversation, even say a quick prayer, put the right words in my mouth. I do that a lot. And then listen to that prompting. And so as I walk into that, taking that pause and that big breath makes a world of difference. When I'm looking at words, I quickly try to assess what is my intention with this conversation. Is my intention to help this employee be better? Is my intention to get them to have better productivity? Is my intention strictly because the company or the business needs this? Mm-hmm. And there is a value point with that person, and we'll get to that, but sometimes it's just as a leader to say the business needs this. Mm-hmm. And here's how it benefits.
And I also hear you saying a little bit about like hinting to the concept of preparation. right? Like the idea that if I'm heading into a conversation that I know may be delivering content that is controversial, difficult, critical to outcomes, that as a manager, I maybe need to prepare for that conversation.
I would say, to me, there's a difference between coaching and counseling. So when you coach an individual, that's usually just looking at and saying what went well, what didn't go so well. If you had the opportunity to do it again, what would you change? And let's figure this out. Maybe a little training moment with that. Counseling really is, I know that you have the knowledge and skill to do this behavior. I've seen this behavior. I'm not so certain you have the motivation, which is just simply seeing the value in it. And this behavior needs to change, or there will be some potential negative consequences, right? There's always a positive and negative consequence to any kind of choice. And so to me, those are two different conversations. And I would say I prepare for both. So when I go in and I'm coaching someone and I have some development with them, I write down, as a matter of fact, even for these, I have a little sticky note that I have some key main points that I want to cover to make sure that I hit those points. Same thing in counseling. I have a little sticky note that I tend to have bullet points. When I first started out, and I will tell you, anytime you have to have a conversation with someone that potentially has a negative impact, if there's not some nerves or a little bit of a pit in your stomach, then you need to get out of leadership. You know, there's always that little bit of, ugh, because you're dealing with a person and it's not fun to go into sometimes these conflict conversations. But later we'll talk a little bit about courageous leadership. And it's really about also shifting your lens to say, when I go into a counseling session with someone, I go back and prepare, what's the intention of this? It's to point out sometimes they're unconsciously incompetent that this is happening. And so it's a start of a process. It might be the third time I've had this conversation with them. And again, I need to understand, do they see the value in doing this particular task or being on time to work? You know, what is it that's potentially in the way? And so, yes, I do prepare those bullet points. And I typically, every conversation that's of a counseling nature, I'll typically say, Meredith, what's going on? Because they know why they're in your office or why they're having this conversation with you over the phone. They typically in the back of their minds know that.
And so where does the concept of like permission come in, right? If part of the conversation and my word choice in this either coaching or counseling environment is going to be to give some suggestions around changes, how important is it to ask for permission to deliver that feedback?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in coaching situations or even working with my clients, a lot of times I'll say, are you open to some feedback? And I set that up. 9 times out of 10, people will say yes. Even if they're not, they'll say yes, but they've given that permission. And I do think it's important to ask that. Now, I will tell you, when I work with clients today, that permission is granted within the first session or so. And then it's an assumed as we go forward. Part of what they're paying me for is for me to ask the right questions for them to find their own teacher with inside themselves. But sometimes people are just at a loss. And so I need to say, here's my recommendation. And I am a firm believer, take what you like and leave the rest. You know, something's going to resonate with you or something's not going to. And the same thing in a coaching situation. And it's really about building trust. You know, that people trust you, they trust the intention of what you're doing. I've been in situations where I've been coached and I felt like I was just another coaching client and not someone that maybe that person really cared about intentionally. And then from a counseling situation, I think at that point in time, depending on where you're at in the counseling, again, I found the most effective way is to ask questions, find out what's going on in their life. Sometimes I had an employee one time, she was late every day. She called me a couple of times and told me that she was getting her car license in the same week, 3 different times. And so I sat down with her and I'm like, hey, listen, something's going on.
What's going on?
And I know that part of our value statement was that we would be honest with each other. And I feel like there's something going on here that you're feeling like you have to come up with a story. What's happening? Well, come to find out, she was working sometimes at midnight because she was a designer and she developed training. So she would go home, and at midnight, she was a night person. She'd be there drinking coffee, pounding out all this training material. So that then when she came to work at 8 o'clock, she wouldn't be there till 9:30 because she was up till late. And I'm like, well, that's an easy fix. Let's just shift your work schedule. You don't have to be here.
Right.
But until I uncovered some of that, so then asking those right questions when I'm counseling, and then I don't typically ask for permission because at that point in time, the first couple of times about the same behavior, it might be, are you open to some feedback? But usually it's, let's collaborate and figure out a solution to this problem. And sometimes it is we've tried to collaborate, you have to make a choice.
Mm-hmm.
And so
yeah, and I can see how that plays out too in different situations, right? So if you're in a management position, you have a team of people you're responsible for. You also have a peer group. So like your lateral, your peer group. And then you also have the people that you are responsible to. And how does word choice play into communication across those different groups?
Yeah, Meredith, that's a great question. So I think word choice is important in all of those. I mentioned in an earlier video cast too, some advice I would give new leaders is think about the words you use to describe the people that are on your team to those that are above you.
Yeah, I remember that.
Because typically their impression of that employee is based on the impression you create. So you're an artist and you've got a canvas and you're creating what that picture is going to look like. And so thinking about, not just always being positive Pollyanna, but really thinking about not pigeonholing your people. I found I had an employee one time where this gentleman was pigeonholed earlier. I fed into that as a newer manager, but as time went on, he was passed up for promotions based on some of that image, even though he had changed over time, because it then just became, oh, that's Joe Smith. We all know about Joe Smith. And so being very conscious of those words with those leaders. I think too, it's assessing your audience. So if I'm presenting a proposal to my peers as an executive staff, for instance, in the 2 corporate jobs I had, I'm going to utilize words that matter to them. There goes back to, I used to use this analogy in sales training, that we have there are kind of 3 different learners. So your visual, your kinesthetic, or your auditory. And if I'm selling a house to an auditory person and I say, look at the view from this window, they might go, oh, the view's great. But if I say to them, do you hear the birds singing outside this window? That will resonate more with them because they're auditory versus, the kinesthetic. I might say, do you feel the warm sun coming in from this window? A visual, do you see this beautiful view? It just resonates differently. And so the same thing would hold true with any of those audiences. If I'm working with a board that is answering the Wall Street, that presentation is going to look very different than the one that I would present to a team of people that impacts what happens in Wall Street. Because it's really about finding out what they value and how, because part of that motivation is them seeing the value of completing the task or whatever productivity, or even buying into the vision that you have as a leader.
It's awesome. Awesome. Well, these have been incredibly helpful tips for me today. If someone wanted to understand a little bit more about what you do and how they could receive coaching and counseling from you in their own work as a leader, where would they go to do that?
I would say a couple of different places. One would be my website at www.3v-as-in-victor-consulting.com. And then you can also find me on Facebook and Instagram, 3 Vines Consulting and 3V Consulting. Any one of those 2 combinations usually will pull up on Instagram or Facebook. And there's more information out there. Check out my website because I do have blogs that post. And if you want to sign up for my newsletter that goes into more depth, that you can do that on the website.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thanks again. This is Meredith Banka, your co-host, and Debbie Heiser, the founder of Faith Infused Leadership. And we will see you the next time.
Thank you, Meredith.
Thanks, Debbie.